I have to say, over the last few weeks, I've been in parallel to what could be described as the trauma room. I've been looking at the quarter of a century room in our house here. So with the 25 years, with any period of time, and you were alluding to it in a way there, looking at Victoria, Sandy, you always have to really go and look at it from the period beforehand and just look at what were the grounding forces that prevailed to ensure a certain outcome. And I have to say, I've looked at this period before, and I really, on the basis, maybe this stuff that is filtering through on the centenary, the decades of centenary that we've been commemorating over the last 2 or 3, 5 years. I certainly have been, over the last few weeks, seeing things that I hadn't seen before. And I don't know if that's just a matter of greater attention or whatever it was, but just a different viewpoint on, I suppose, how I would have studied maybe this period, coming up to this period in secondary school and later in university. And I'm coming along with a viewpoint, and I want to be challenged by it if you feel it's fallacious in any way. But what I'll do is I'll start off speaking about that story that we've been monitoring through the last 150 years, the story of the attempt to throw off the shackles of the colonizers, and the various different events that have taken place that in themselves, I would argue, have created their own sense of ritual and have become, in a sense, blessed, in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church blessed certain things. And this is the thing that I would argue, the self-sacrifice and blood sacrifice that was very much intertwined in the rhetoric around the 1916 rebellion is something we've all been looking at over the last number of years. So that isn't anything particularly new. But the forces that go into the insurrection itself at that moment in time go right back to what we had spoken about before. We talked about Parnell, we talked about the land war and the difficulties that these large estates where landowners were rescued by the English government by purchasing a lot of their lands and distributing the land. So in a sense, we're talking about a time now where the land question has been dealt with, and there was a much greater, I suppose, sense of quietness around what had been a very agitating issue itself. So we created a bourgeoisie, in a way, of landowners, mostly small landowners, and that had satisfied what had been a huge breach in the national psyche, which had been the taking away of good, rich lands and sending and pauperizing a whole nation of landowners who became a very much a despoiled society in Ragged, which led to events such as the famine. So the land question having been dealt with was a huge thing in itself. So Parnell had his main preoccupation was certainly home rule. The act of insurrection just prior to, by the insurrection of just before the Act of Union. The Act of Union itself was the solution to insurrection, taking Ireland's control into the British Parliament and having Irish elected themselves to various different constituencies and becoming a force in the British Parliament by themselves as the Irish Home Rule Party, particularly. They're an interesting bunch of people in themselves, but they gained a tremendous amount of following because they certainly were speaking the language of independence of a sort, limited independence. And they, having held the position of power in the British Parliament at various different times, particularly with the Liberal Party, they became very good at leveraging that particular power, and they got commitments to have Home Rule put on the statutes. Now, the Home Rule that was to be put on the statutes was very limited, but nonetheless, it was a major potential win. While that might have been a win for what would be seen as nationalist, maybe Catholic Ireland, Protestant loyalist Ireland up in the northeast was very much afeared. And I've always wondered about this, or dismissed it to some extent. But the more I read about it now, and the more I read about, to some extent, what you described there, Sandy, about the church triumphant with its fantastic church building, etc., 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 and all of the various scandals, this idea that that Home Rule would be Rome rule seemed like a fallacy to me. I dismissed it entirely. But I now understand that the Ulster Protestants, both Church of Ireland Protestant and Presbyterian Protestant, were very afeared that, having held sway for such a long period of time, if the situation was reversed and nationalist Ireland had its own parliament, retribution would be the result. The enemy would in fact have control over lives, and that their religion was going to be at peril, that the papists were going to take over and they would be ruined. Also, there was an economic element to it, because there was a great belief that the tie with the United Kingdom had a lot of economic advantages to it in terms of I suppose, import and export and the various different arrangements that were there, and that might put itself put that into peril. So here you have a very, very, I suppose in a way, a very fearful group who saw down south this very strong and very influential, I suppose, cabal in their view, that were going to potentially hold sway if the Home Rule Bill went through. Now, there are a lot of machinations going on in the politics of that, but think about it psychologically. If you've been the dominant tribe, let's say, for a long period of time, and had a lot of preference because of that particular position, if you thought that those that you had dominated and perhaps maybe suppressed, if they were going to actually gain a position, they had a reasonable right to be fearful. And that, to my mind, coupled with the exploitation by the Conservative Party in England, who called themselves the Conservative and Unionist Party, they managed to drumbeat, and it's a little bit like that tribalism. They managed to beat a drum to the point of creating more and more tension in Ulster, that their position was going to be pretty much screwed. So from that point of view, you had events, I don't know if you recall, where a huge number of people signed a covenant of oath of allegiance.
Mm.
And that was to be in their own blood. This was a sacred covenant by something like 80,000 Ulster men, that they would fight. Ulster would fight and Ulster would be right. But the extraordinary thing about this is that the Law and Order political party in the UK, the Conservatives, had at this stage a leader called Bonar Law. He was actually a Canadian born in Canada of Scots background and Ulster background. And he was ferociously pro-unionist. And he made quite a bargain with the wonderful leader that the Ulster Unionists had at this stage, which was Edward Carson, born in Dublin, educated in Trinity, a fantastic lawyer, was one of the leading lawyers, in fact, in London, and was also an MP. And he had actually, there's some very interesting things. The issue of that drumbeat that I say was actually a clarion call to defy these papists and defy home rule, was really engineered extraordinarily. They knew the words that they could use. Bonar Law made a huge speech to 100,000 Ulstermen just outside of Belfast in 1912, and what he said was that he called on the people there to recall the fact that they had held sway against the enemy, the enemy of the empire. And what he was talking about was Londonderry, as it's called, and he was saying that the apprentice boys had actually held off against the Gaelic and Catholic armies, and they were the heroes. And he was calling again to this patriotism to defend the empire. Now, it's an extraordinary thing, because here is the leader of the Conservative Party, and what he was advocating, and said it quite openly at another time, that if the Liberal government, which had at this stage under Asquith, was actually going to create a home rule, and it had passed the House of Commons, or just about to pass the House of Commons, and no longer the House of Lords had been taken away their right to actually keep down legislation. That had been a huge victory in itself. He was saying that this would be a government that was under the leverage and enthralled to the Redmondites, to the papist Irish, and that they didn't really have authority, or they were not, in a sense, that it was a trick against the parliament, because it wasn't right. They didn't agree with it. So they were talking about insurrection. And in fact, what they recall at that time was very, very similar to when we spoke about a time when Chowbang was telling us about the Civil War in England, when the Roundheads and the Long Parliament, where there was a civil war. They ended up beheading their king. And these were echoing voices telling the Ulster people that to fight and save the empire, they would defy the English government. Extraordinary stuff. And you might recall there had been, because of the tension that was growing up, there was 58 officers of the British Army put in their resignations in the Curragh, because they said they won't be used to coerce the Ulster loyalists. So there was an extraordinary piece of tension. And of course, when you have one side, very partisan, on one side with that defending of their faith, on the other side, you had I suppose, the nationalist Ireland, who was coming towards, to some extent, a triumph, having a home rule and getting back its ability to rule itself to some extent in a limited way. They started to bang their own drum, and that built up of, while you had something like 120,000 people signed up to the Ulster Volunteers, you had 190,000 for the Irish Volunteers. So you had another major private armies to a great extent. You had gun running in Larne. They brought in huge amounts of ammunition and guns, and they were drilling in the streets. And the British Army did nothing to stop that. When Erskine Childers, and when they were bringing in the guns in Howth, Erskine Childers, etc., they actually did it in daylight, and there was a problem when they managed to get all the guns away, but strangely enough, there was a shooting, and some of the British shot some innocent bystanders pretty much that day down around the Quays. But what I'm saying is that there's a tremendous amount of tension has been building up, and it's about nationalism versus loyalism, and to some extent has been made sectarian. Now, the wonderful thing about the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and this goes back into what I suppose the other part of the story, there was an attempt by the United Irishmen not to be sectarian. While nationalists very often were seen as being Catholic, they were also, there were a lot of other co-religion, different religions, etc., as well, and no religions. But they attempted very much not to be sectarian. I'm going to read you something that, just in terms of time, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but you can see that what's happening here. There's two groupings, and very sincerely held fears and beliefs. And what you have on top of all of that is this real sound coming from the continent, where the echoes of the First World War are about to be heard very, very soundly. And that has huge implications for what happens next. And there were some very, very interesting people. With John Redmond, he was a home ruler, but very, very conservative in what he would have expected. And he made a speech, in fact, that very much against his political reputation, a speech which said that the Irish should actually join the British Army and go and fight for the British Army. He really believed that everything that the British had promised him that he was going to get, that naivety was something else. And there's something tragic about that. That got a ferocious negative impact, as you can imagine, in Ireland at that time. Although a lot of people did join the British Army. I'm just thinking, the forces that were not just about the revolutionary forces, but the cultural forces that had gone to the point that had created a very strong nationalist position. And these were things like the development of the Gaelic League under the tremendous stewardship of Douglas Deheda, and that whole attempt to show how wonderfully beautiful our language was, and to ensure that we try and get it back into the national schools and have people learning it, because at that stage academics were the only people who really knew about our ancient history, knew about our ancient customs and our ancient games. Michael Cusack would have just created the GAA. All of those forces were there. While they weren't political and they weren't revolutionary, but in effect they were revolutionary, because what they did was they really underlined the sense of pride that the Irish really had and should have. I'll just quote one thing if I could, and it's going back to to Davis, and I know I'm going back quite a long time, but the Nation newspaper in the 1840s, Thomas Davis's legacy in the paper, they set out to create a spirit of pride and an identity based on nationality rather than on social status or religion. I think that's something that's really good. And they say later on, Patrick Pearse said, using that nationality is spirituality. So you have these very, they're fairly heady stuff. And now I know I'm going to run out of time. I'm not going to bring ourselves into the GPO. I'm going to have to do that some other time. But I'm just saying that you had these forces that were in Ireland at this time. And in the preparation for all of these various organizations like the Irish Volunteers, the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Gaelic League, you had somebody like Patrick Pearse, who, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they were very much embedded into these organizations, and they had a huge belief in themselves. They were a secret, oath-bound, fraternal organization dedicated to the establishment of an independent republic in Ireland. And they had counterparts in the United States, the Fenian Brotherhood, they would have been known there as Clan na Gael, Fenians generally. So that bedrock of belief in the use of force to create an Irish republic, not some crumbs from Mother Parliament in Westminster, but an autonomous Irish republic. It was quite an ambition. But here is Mr. Pearse speaking, and I'm not going to quote it all, but speaking at the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa. And he starts off saying, "It has seemed right, before we turn away from this place in which we have laid the mortal remains of O'Donovan Rossa, that one amongst us should, in the name of all, speak the praise of that valiant man, and endeavour to formulate the thought and the hope that are in us as we stand around his grave. And if there is anything that makes it fitting that I, rather than some other, rather than one of the grey-haired men who were young with him and shared in his labour and in his suffering, should speak here, it is perhaps that I may be taken as speaking on behalf of a new generation that has been rebaptized in the Fenian faith and that has accepted the responsibility of carrying out the Fenian programme." It goes on. He calls on Tone's definition of Mitchell's, various different elements. And I think you probably know the very end of it. It's a bit like Emmett's speech from the dock, and what Parnell had said, no one should ever stand in the way of the destiny of a nation. But those wonderful lines, "Rulers and defenders of realms had need to be wary," Pearse says, "if they would guard against such processes. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring live nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything. They think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." To be discussed further.
Great.